Thank you for tuning in to Better Business Bureau's 2020 Cybersecurity Program. Our next speaker is Bruce Wray. He has been practicing law for over 6 years, focusing on information technology, information security, and intellectual property law, and is a certified information systems security professional. Currently, Bruce is in-house counsel handling technology and information security procurement for a global fintech company and formerly worked at a national law firm with their IP/IT practice group providing both transactional and litigation protections for global clients' complex needs. Prior to law school, Bruce worked for over a decade in information technology and has a master's degree in computer science focused on information assurance and mathematics. Without further ado, Bruce Wray.
First topics will probably be the security primer. Will probably run through relatively quickly, just to kind of give everybody a common language for it. So within information security, we'll look at the kind of the triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality is the basis of only those having access or needing the information get that information. And again, the sensitivity of what of the data that you're protecting is what is going to determine the strength of the protective controls and the steps that are necessary for it. Again, confidentiality is something that exists and needs to be thought about at a policy level, at a practical computer network security level, and then also at a physical security level. Obviously, with the changes to work from home and the societal changes with the pandemic, physical security is a different concept, right? You're not putting a security guard at each of your employees' home locations, but it is something to consider what your home. Sorry, I've got a couple of middle. There we go. I think I'm getting everybody in now. There we go. Sorry for the interruption. But bearing in mind what their physical security environments, what their physical environment is going to look like, and then a lot of what we're going to talk about today are some of the computer and network security issues related to that. Looking at integrity, basically the information that's stored remains as it was stored, so we don't have data getting modified without record or somebody knowing about it. Again, the unauthorized modification. A compromise in integrity is going to have ripple effects that are at times hard to get. So we want to bear in mind both restricting access to it, but also making sure that once the data that we have stored remains unaltered, we don't lose any accuracy or reliability on that. Again, we've got physical security, network security, and policy-related issues surrounding that. It's worthwhile noting that integrity is related to the accuracy, but it's not itself accuracy. So you can maintain the integrity of data while still having inaccuracies within the data itself. The third leg of the information security stool, the availability, and the start of our conference this morning is sort of an example, making sure that the access is available when needed. And that's not always easy to deal with and grapple with. That's definitely something that I think every company, large and small, has had to make adjustments for, is making sure that the tools that you had in place have scaled up to what's going to be necessary or work for a larger group. I know that's when you had 10% of your workforce or maybe less than 10% of your workforce that was working from home with any regularity, and work from home meant a day or two out of the office, to suddenly having 100% of your workforce remote 5 days a week. All of your network security tools, your VPN, multi-factor authentication, all of these technical pieces that are going to be in place and useful and necessary to enable that access suddenly starts having some strain, right? Do you need to add additional the VPN servers to connect to, so you've got greater bandwidth and availability on those services for the folks needing it. Through that, okay. So some of the common terms or pieces to run through and think about. We've got identification, which is related to the uniquely identifying each entity. Entity is relatively broad term covering both users, computers, programs, down to very, very granular level within applications. But basically everything has and gets a unique identifier, no shared no shared identities. This is going to become more critical when you're dealing with a work from home environment, and trying to make sure that you've got folks appropriately identified on it. Authentication. So if identification is the claim, authentication is the proof of that claim. It's the basis for trust and accountability. It's the password and the credentials that are used to access the identity. Authorization is the permissions that result off of that authentication. Um, Authorization also relates to, ties into the confidentiality thread in terms of making sure that you've got the appropriate controls and restrictions in place for who has access to that data. Access, again, is a relatively overloaded term, but access is going to, as it ties in here, is going to relate to what they're allowed to do with data that they can have and see, as well as what data they can get to and see, what resources they have, which servers and connectivity they can get. And access control kind of ties all of it together. It's the piece that lays out how you both allow and restrict access. So looking at some of the cybersecurity strategies, we've got defense in depth as one of the key concepts, wanting to layer on additional protections so that a failure or a compromise of one particular issue doesn't result in you've got multiple layers to that defense, multiple layers to that protection. So you can, for example, run firewalls, you've got layered authentication mechanisms, principle of least privilege. So, and this is something that may vary depending upon where you're at. So when you were in the office environment, connecting to the corporate network was a lot easier because you're physically connected to it, either with a direct hardwired connection, or through campus-wide Wi-Fi or something of that nature. When you're in a remote environment, you may end up in a situation where you're running single sign-on authentication at each browser tab window. That may be in conjunction or in addition to VPN connectivity. This also plays into the defensive depth and having different layers of authentication or appropriate checks in place. And again, the whole point of that is you're not having any more access than is necessary for a particular job role or function. Kind of as a last note here, the audit and record retention pieces. Dealing in a work from home environment, a lot of times the electronic audit records are all you're going to have for some of the information about where the employee is, what work is getting completed, how it's getting handled, and so those are going to take on a little bit higher focus. So looking quickly at some of the direct cybersecurity risks. Anytime we start talking about risk, we're talking about a probability of an event occurring, extrapolated by the impact or the cost of that event occurring. So we can have a risk that has a very, very high probability of occurring, but has a relatively low impact on it. And so if it's a high probability, low impact, it's probably going to be prioritized for remediation at a lower level than something that is potentially a massive impact event but has a low priority. But this is going to kind of be the metric that we're using to evaluate risk generally. When we look at it from work from home, we need to be thinking about and aware of the confidentiality, integrity, and availability priorities when we run through and deal with work from home risks. This is going to relate to dealing with the types of employees that you're working to solve for. And the criteria that are in play here are going to vary company to company. There are going to be specific tools and technologies that each of these groups of employees or categories of employees are going to need, and that's going to have an impact on what might be an appropriate work from home solution for those. And then kind of as a last point, any ability to leverage native cloud-based technology or tools can help sometimes streamline what you're dealing with from a work from home environment. Um, the this is a top 5 list for risk from 2020. Depending upon when your top 5 list was written in 2020, this list might look a little bit different because the world looked a little bit different in February than it does now in October. Um, Still prevalent as a risk for companies is ransomware. Basically, this is a form of malware that embeds itself into your network or your laptop, server, device, um, in, throws a layer of encryption over the data and basically forces the company or the entity to make some financial payment in order to be able to unlock or get that data back. Um, Phishing, and I won't go into this in great depth because Ashley's going to cover this in her portion of the presentation. But it's social engineering um, attempt to gain access to information, essentially posing as a trustworthy contact. Data leakage is going to be a thing we'll talk about a little bit further when we get into the specific work from home issues with cybersecurity, because data leakage takes on a different context when everybody's connecting remotely. Um, Hacking, essentially attempting to gain access to IT systems from outside an organization. And then, of course, insider threats is the final piece. Insider threats are always going to be an issue, and a work from home environment are going to take on sort of a different context, right? Because the insider threats are going to have different access, different levels of access, but also, you know, do your work from home employees have an ability to print to a local printer from their home laptop? Is that something you're going to allow? Is that something you're going to deny? Is that something you're going to, provisionally allow depending upon the individual context on it? Those are all certain issues to consider related to access and what you're going to allow in a work from home environment. So looking at work from home, some of the considerations again, um, anytime you're dealing with employees, you want to make sure that that you're ensuring that they've got a safe, secure, and productive work environment. Um, in March, our thoughts on what would have been appropriate potentially were different than where we were in April and May. Um, I know depending upon the company size, not every employee had laptops. Not every employee had a device that was easy to use in a work from home environment. Are you having the employees work on personal laptops? Are you providing a corporate or a laptop that you control and manage? All things to consider and weigh in the calculus here. And again, we want to maintain the security, availability, and continuity of services for our customers, right? That's our overarching goal on this. So looking at the employee, some of the things to consider from an employee standpoint: are you dealing with technical employees? Are you dealing with business management? Are you dealing with customer support? Is this a risk and fraud type operation? These different categories and buckets um, may dictate different steps and different roles in place for it, right? Because your customer support folks are going to need a different tool set to complete their job in a work from home environment than perhaps technical staff will. The next thing to consider is use of public cloud, and polls. I'm going to present a polling question here, launch polling. How many of you are using some form of public cloud, whether it's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service? Let those results come in. Um, Anytime you're dealing with public cloud, anytime you're dealing with cloud infrastructure of any sort, whether it's infrastructure platform or software as a service, one of the key factors to consider is who's going to own the risk. who owns the particular security principles, which entity is managing identity verification. Is that something your company is handling, and uh, handling authentication through a single sign-on mechanism for the cloud service, or is that something where the cloud service is going to essentially operate and manage its own security? Um, Looks like we've got about an even split right now of folks using public cloud. So public cloud infrastructure, I'm going to go ahead and end polling on that one. So we had 33 responses, 17 yeses, 16 nos on who's using some form of public cloud. Again, public cloud usage is probably going to vary a little bit depending upon entity size.
I'm just wondering how things are going today.
So the cyber fraud, the FBI perspective. This was from a recent Omaha World Herald article. Just a reminder, if you're on, if you could mute, so we're not carrying through for everybody on the call.
How are things at the office?
Things at the office are well, thanks. Okay, so this is in an Omaha World Herald article. The Jake Foyles, an FBI special investigator with the cybercrime unit, did a presentation. I think.
Hang on 1 second. Hang on.
Yep,
1
there
second.
we go. So in 2009, online fraud resulted in more than 18 million in losses for the state of Nebraska alone. Business email compromise is one of the most common types of scams, and again, that's going to encompass a lot of the issues that Ashley's going to run through and talk about. Another thing that complicates some of the security, and again, the FBI, this particular set of information is based more so on general recommendations for cyber fraud as an individual, as opposed to looking at it at an entity level or a corporate level. But these are going to trickle down and roll into it. So if you've heard of the Internet of Things, the number of connected devices and appliances that are accessing and connecting to the internet essentially creates a much higher surface area related to devices that need to be secured. This comes into play for both corporate environments as well as you at home, right? So do you have devices in the house, whether they're Amazon or Google or Apple based, that do voice recognition and response on particular keywords? All of those things are going to increase and adjust the surface area of information that needs to be secured. And one of the final notes that the FBI special investigator noted was password tendencies for reuse. Again, this is probably going to be a bigger issue in an individual capacity than in a corporate capacity, where you have a bit more control over passwords. But it is something to bear in mind there. So some of the recommendations from the FBI: don't reuse passwords, use multi-factor authentication. This is something that applies for both an individual basis, so you can enable multi-factor authentication through most online banking platforms now, and even like your Gmail account and other pieces can touch on and handle multi-factor. I'm going to launch the next poll on whether or not your company is using multi-factor authentication. And we'll let those results come in. So multi-factor authentication, when you connect to the VPN, do you get a separate ping or authentication piece, for example, on your work or corporate phone? Do you have a specific dongle or something that is so in authentication, you've got the information that I am. So biometric, do I have a thumbprint or something else? Something that I have. So in an office environment, that your badge that allows you in and through the door is something that I have. In a multi-factor authentication from a remote access standpoint, you might be running it through a corporate phone. You might be running it through a dongle that's connected to your keychain, a keychain type dongle that you've got to have synced up with. RSA, for example, is one of the vendors in that space. Looks like 33 responses so far. About 70% are using some form of multi-factor authentication. I'll go ahead and close that poll. Not using default usernames and passwords. Again, this is probably going to be something that comes up more on an individual basis. Regularly updating your software. Looking at this from a work from home and a corporate environment. If you are issuing company devices for the work from home to support the work from home, you're going to have a bit better control over requiring or forcing some form of software update with regularity. Okay, let's look at some of the cyber fraud prevention pieces, and I'll wrap up here with this. Data theft is again one of the issues that is going to be prevalent in dealing with work from home, and it's a bit of a change from what we're used to in an office corporate environment. You want to make sure that your employees are working off of secure networks, so not going necessarily to the coffee shop or to other public networks when they're connecting into your corporate environment. Utilizing the tools available for firewalls and virus scanners for remote employees, issuing company-owned devices rather than having them work from their own personal computers, and then essentially making sure that you've got a set form of management on those devices that they're connecting with. Some of the overarching or longer term fixes: having employees read and sign acceptable use policy, providing annual security training to employees are something that are going to be more critical in a prolonged work from home environment. Time theft, we'll sort of cover this quickly, but in a traditional environment, you oftentimes would have had only longer serving employees or high performing employees, somebody that you had confidence in what was going on from a work from home environment. Now with the pandemic, that's sort of the calculus on that sort of changed a little bit. But having clear guidelines for what is required of their telecommuting, what is required of their, when they need to be connected, when they need to be working, and what their workday looks like, when they need to be available. I've certainly found from a personal basis that there tends to be a lot more blurring of the line between when, before work started versus when work ends. It tends to get a bit soft on each side, and flexibility is something that to note, especially with the stresses and everything that your employees and everybody essentially in society is dealing with the pandemic. It is to bear in mind that there may need to be a bit more flexibility with work hours, and looking at a different measure of success and completion of work. We'll talk a little bit on payroll fraud, whether or not you're, in this covers a payroll fraud as well as any of it. Given the remote connectivity and the changes, having a close watch and a division of responsibilities so that folks receiving accounts receivable aren't the same folks that are handling accounts payable. That you've got reconciliation of balance sheets related to payrolls, that you're rotating the financial tasks, so you're able to detect if there's a discrepancy or an issue. And something else that sort of fits into dealing with a work from home environment, your employees are now, their office space is their home, and are you're not able to offer ergonomic assistance in the same way you would in an office, but that is something that still needs to be considered and suggested, whether that's encouraging healthy habits so that they stand and stretch, whether that's offering, sit stand desks that they can take home, dual monitors that they're taking home, whatever the case may be, is something to bear in mind there. So education will be the last piece we want to run through, and I'll run through that relatively quickly. I just kind of note employees will fail every requirement that they don't know exists. So having a strong annual compliance training that outlines what their expectations are, what the policies and procedures are. Stall is something, and this will come up a bit more with the phishing pieces, but anytime you're dealing with information, whether it's a text message that you've received or an email that you've received, who's the sender, what's the tone, are there attachments, are there particular links, and are those links safe or not, and is it requesting any type of login information? So then a couple of quick tips, email tips. Again, this is going to dovetail a lot with the stall. don't reply to emails that are requesting personal information. Be dubious of emails that you get and aren't expecting. Online security, a couple of things to just call out quick on this one. Being aware of lookalike websites, being aware of websites that look like or are built with the intent to copy other websites. This sort of dovetails and follows the FBI's notes on passwords. Choose passwords that are difficult to guess. Use different passwords. Change them frequently. In a corporate environment, it's a lot easier to have requirements for what goes into the password, that you've got letters and numbers, upper and lowercase, punctuation. With that, I will turn the presentation back over to Jeff.